She used her last dime to fix a man's broken wheelchair. She never asked for anything in return, just wanted him to move freely. Elise Morgan was a mechanic in a small Wyoming town, tinkering with machines to survive. One day, the Air Force lifted her up, and everything changed. Why did the Air Force come? How could her small act spark this? What's the greatest thing you've given up for a stranger? Let's find out. Welcome to True Quiet Stories. Let's uncover what happened in this story. If you love these stories, you can support the channel by liking and subscribing. In a small Wyoming town, the wind carries whispers of grit. Elise Morgan lived there. She was 31 years old. She worked as a mechanic, running Morgan's Fix-It shop, a tiny garage on the edge of town. Elise's days were tough. She repaired engines, welded frames, and fixed tires, her hands stained with grease from years of labor. She nodded at customers, even when her arms ached, even when the bills piled up, even when the weight of keeping her shop open felt too heavy to bear. Her short blonde hair was always tucked under a worn bandana, her coveralls patched at the knees, her eyes tired but warm. A warmth that came from a heart that had known struggle, that had known loss, that had known hope. A heart that gave even when it had little to give, even when the world didn't give back, even when the plains seemed to take more than they offered. Elise lived alone in a small trailer behind her shop, a rusty space with a leaky roof, a folding chair, and a window that overlooked the endless fields. The howling wind, a constant reminder of the things she couldn't fix, of the things she couldn't afford, of the things she couldn't change. Her father, who'd taught her to fix anything with a wrench, had passed away 4 years ago, a lung disease from years in the mines, leaving Elise to run the shop alone, to keep his tools turning alone, to hold on to his legacy alone, even in the silence, even in the wind, even in the years that had passed since he was gone. Elise kept going. She worked hard, but she had a kind heart. She gave kindness. It was all she could afford. Elise's life in Rock Creek, Wyoming, was a daily fight against the elements and the past. The town had seen better days, its streets lined with dusty storefronts, its fields parched by endless summers, its people worn by years of hard work, years of dreams deferred, years of a life that seemed to take more than it gave. Rock Creek was a small community, just over 2,000 people, a place where everyone knew everyone, where Morgan's Fix-It shop had been a fixture for decades, a garage where locals brought their broken machines, shared stories, and found a moment of connection, a business that Elise's grandfather had started, that Elise had inherited from her father, that Elise fought to keep alive, even when the odds were against her, even when the jobs were scarce, even when the world seemed to forget her shop, to forget her family, to forget her. She grew up in Rock Creek, in a small house on Sagebrush Lane, where her parents had raised her with love, with grit, with the belief that hard work was the greatest gift you could give, that kindness was the greatest thing you could share, that hope was the greatest thing you could hold, even when the world was harsh, even when the nights were long, even when the struggles were heavy. Her father, Henry, had been a miner-turned-mechanic, his hands rough as he turned wrenches, his voice warm as he taught Elise how to fix a carburetor, his laughter a bright spot in their small home, a laughter that Elise still heard even now. Years after he was gone, years after the lung disease took him, years after the shop became her burden, her legacy, her life. Her mother, Clara, had been a teacher, her smile a comfort to every child, her hands quick as she graded papers, her faith a steady anchor for their family. Her prayers a nightly ritual that Elise still whispered, even now, years after she was gone, years after the cancer took her, years after the shop became her responsibility, her memory, her love. They didn't have much money, their meals simple but hearty. Stew on Sundays, beans on weekdays, a rare treat of pie when the budget allowed. But they had each other, and that made their small house a haven, a place where Elise always felt safe, always felt loved, always felt whole. Those memories were all Elise had left after her parents passed. a double loss that came in the span of 5 years. Her father's lung disease, a slow fade that ended on a quiet winter night. Her mother's cancer, a sudden blow 2 summers later, leaving a void Elise couldn't fill. She'd been 26 then, her hand still steady, her dreams still alive, but her world forever changed. Her heart heavy with grief, with debt, with a life that seemed to demand more than she could give, more than she could bear, more than she could hold. She threw herself into her work, fixing from dawn to dusk, her hands steady as she welded, her back aching from lifting parts, her heart heavy with the weight of loss, with the weight of responsibility, with the weight of a shop that was always breaking, a shop that hadn't turned a profit in months, a shop that reminded her of everything she'd lost, everything she couldn't afford, everything she couldn't fix, even in the silence, even in the wind, even in the years that had kept her apart. But Elise had a kind heart, a heart that still beat with the lessons her parents taught her, with the love they'd shared, with the hope she held for a better day, a hope that lived on in the small acts of kindness she offered, even now, even here, even in the shadows where no one saw her, where no one cared, where no one knew. She worked with care, taking pride in the machines she fixed, making sure every engine roared, every customer was cared for, every job was done right. A quiet gift to the people who filled her days, even if they never noticed, even if they never thanked her, even if they never saw the effort she put in, the love she poured into every repair, the heart she gave to every task. One dusty afternoon in early June, as Elise was tinkering with a rusty lawnmower in her garage, she heard a faint creak from the street outside. The Wyoming wind was relentless, carrying grit that stung her cheeks as she worked, the heat of the day mixing with the dry air to make her throat scratchy. She adjusted her worn bandana, her hands stained with grease, her fingers sore from the day's labor, a labor that had yielded just enough to buy a few groceries, a labor that reminded her of the empty bank account, a labor that she couldn't escape, even in the silence, even in the wind, even in the moments that passed her by. She looked up, her eyes squinting against the glare of the sun, and saw a figure struggling to move along the cracked pavement, a man in a wheelchair, its wheels wobbling and squeaking, his arms straining with every push, his face etched with frustration, a frustration Elise understood, a frustration she felt, a frustration she couldn't ignore. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, didn't know the weight he carried, but she knew the look of someone who'd been left behind, the look of someone who needed to move, who needed kindness, who needed hope even if he didn't ask for it, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Elise set down her wrench, her step steady as she walked over, her voice soft as she offered help, even if she didn't know who he was, even if she didn't know why, even if she didn't know what would come of it. The man's name was Frank Harris, though Elise didn't know that at the time, didn't know the story behind those tired eyes, didn't know the weight he carried, the weight of a war that had taken everything, the weight of a life that had left him with nothing, the weight of a silence that had become his only companion, his only comfort, his only truth. Frank was 76 years old, a veteran of the Korean War, a man who'd served as a pilot in the U.S. Air Force, who'd flown missions over the skies of Korea in 1952, who'd seen things he couldn't unsee, who'd done things he couldn't undo, who'd lost things he couldn't reclaim. He'd been a hero once, a man who'd saved his squadron during a critical mission, landing his damaged plane under enemy fire to rescue a downed crew, his own body broken by the crash, his own heart scarred by the screams of the men he couldn't save, by the faces of the friends he'd lost, by the guilt that had followed him home, that had followed him through the years, that had followed him to the streets of Rock Creek, where he now struggled, where he now rolled, where he now survived. On the edges of a town that had forgotten him, on the edges of a world that had moved on without him, on the edges of a life that had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back, the dog tag around his neck, the memories in his mind, the silence in his heart. Frank had lost everything after the war, his family, his home, his mobility, his very sense of self. the war a thief that had taken more than he could ever hope to reclaim. He'd come home to Rock Creek in 1954, a different man than the one who'd left, his legs paralyzed from the crash, his smile gone, his heart heavier with the things he'd seen, the things he'd done, the things he couldn't undo. His wife, Eleanor, had tried to help, her gentle hands a comfort, her soft voice a lifeline, her love a beacon in the darkness that had consumed him, that had changed him, that had broken him in ways she couldn't fix, in ways he couldn't share, in ways they couldn't survive. But the pain was too much, the isolation too real, the guilt too heavy, the trauma too strong, a force that pulled him under, that pulled him away, that pulled him apart, until Eleanor couldn't hold on anymore, until she passed away from a heart attack in 1975, leaving Frank alone with their son Daniel. A son who grew up and moved to Denver, seeking a life far from the shadow of a father who couldn't find his way back, who couldn't find his peace, who couldn't find his home. Frank didn't blame him, didn't fight him, didn't beg him to stay, knowing he was right, knowing he was broken, knowing he couldn't be the father Daniel deserved, the man he'd once been, the man he'd never be again. Frank had been living in a small shack on the outskirts of Rock Creek for years, a crumbling structure with no heat, a sagging cot, and a single shelf that held his few possessions. A place where he kept his memories, a place where he kept his silence, a silence that had become his home, his truth, his everything. On that shelf was a faded photo of Eleanor and Daniel, taken on Daniel's 8th birthday, their smiles bright against a sunny park backdrop. A moment of joy frozen in time, a moment Frank held on to, a moment that broke his heart, that kept him alive, that kept him hoping, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't know how, even if he didn't know what for. There was also a letter Eleanor wrote him during the war. The paper yellowed, the ink faded, but the words still legible, words of love and hope that had kept him going through the darkest nights, words he read when the loneliness felt too heavy to bear. And there was his Distinguished Flying Cross, a medal he'd been awarded for his bravery in Korea, a medal he'd buried in a box, a medal he couldn't look at, a medal that felt like a mockery of the pain he carried, of the lives he couldn't save, of the man he'd once been, a man he'd lost, a man he'd never be again. Elise didn't hesitate that afternoon, didn't question, didn't let Frank struggle alone, even though she barely knew him, even though her own funds were down to her last dime, even though her own shop was on the brink, a risk she understood, a risk she felt, a risk she couldn't ignore. She wheeled Frank into her garage, her hand steady as she examined the chair, her eyes sharp as she spotted the broken wheel and rusted axle, her heart heavy as she thought of the man before her, as she thought of his struggle, as she thought of the freedom she knew he needed, the freedom she'd needed, the freedom she couldn't let slip away. She used her last dime to buy the parts, her voice steady as she called her supplier, her resolve firm as she worked late into the night, even if she didn't know his story, even if she didn't know his pain, even if she didn't know what would come of it. Frank sat nearby, his hands trembling as he watched, his eyes glistening with gratitude, his heart a little lighter, his burden a little less, his loneliness a little softer, knowing someone cared, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. For days, Elise checked on Frank, a small act of kindness that became a ritual, a quiet promise between two souls who'd barely spoken, who'd never needed to, who understood each other in the way only the weary can, in the way only those who've known struggle can, in the way only those who've been forgotten can. Each morning Frank would roll past Morgan's fix-it shop, his wheelchair gliding smoothly thanks to Elise's repairs, his arms moving with less strain, his hands clutching the wheels with a newfound ease. An ease that held the warmth of Elise's kindness, a warmth that held the memory of his past, a warmth that held the hope of a better day, even in the silence, even in the wind, even in the years that had kept him apart. Elise never asked for anything in return, never told anyone, never let Frank feel small for needing help, for needing mobility, for needing kindness, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it, even if he didn't know her story, even if he didn't know her pain, even if he didn't know the weight she carried, the sacrifice she'd made, the life she lived in the shadows, in the plains, in the silence that had become her home. Frank would nod as he passed, his hand steady on the wheels, his eyes glistening with gratitude, his heart a little lighter, his burden a little less, his loneliness a little softer. Knowing someone cared, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Elise's act of kindness went unnoticed by most, a silent gesture in a world that rarely stopped to see the quiet heroes, the ones who gave without asking for anything in return, the ones who loved without expecting love back, the ones who kept going even when the world didn't care, even when the world didn't see, even when the world didn't know. But one person did notice, a person who saw more than most, a person whose own life had been touched by the kind of quiet heroism Elise embodied, a person who knew the weight of a past unspoken, the power of a kindness unseen, the value of a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing in return. Her name was Major Emily Carter, a regular customer at Morgan's Fix-It Shop, a 42-year-old officer in the U.S. Air Force stationed at F.E. Warren Air Force Base, a woman who'd served in Afghanistan, who'd known pilots like Frank, who'd seen the toll war took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that Frank carried, a silence Emily recognized, a silence she understood, a silence she couldn't ignore. Emily saw Elise fix Frank's wheelchair one evening, her hands pausing as she dropped off her truck for a tune-up, her eyes catching the quiet exchange, the way Elise's face softened as she tightened the last bolt, the way Frank's eyes glistened with gratitude as he rolled away, the way the moment held a weight Emily couldn't ignore, a weight that spoke of kindness, of love, of a hero forgotten, even in the silence, even in the wind, even in the years that had kept him apart. She approached Elise the next day, her voice steady as she asked about the man, about the wheelchair, about the kindness she'd given, about the love she'd shared, even if she'd barely known him, even if she'd given everything, even if she'd never expected anything in return, even in the silence, even in the plains, even in the years that had kept her apart. Elise told her everything, her voice trembling as she spoke, her words a bridge between the past and the present, between the silence and the sound, between the plains and the sky, a bridge that brought Frank's story to life, that brought Elise's kindness to light, that brought a hero back, finally, after all these years, after all the silence, after all the wind that had kept him apart. Emily didn't stop there, couldn't stop there, wouldn't stop there, knowing Frank's story deserved more, knowing Elise's kindness deserved more, knowing a hero deserved more, even in the silence, even in the plains, even in the years that had kept him apart. She drove back to F.E. Warren Air Force Base that evening, her heart heavy with the weight of what she'd learned, with the weight of what she knew she had to do, with the weight of a story that deserved to be told, a story that deserved to be heard, a story that deserved to be honored even if no one else saw, even if no one else cared, even if the world kept moving on without them. She called her commanding officer, Colonel James Riley, a man who'd served in Korea, who'd known pilots like Frank, who'd seen the toll war took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that Frank carried, a silence James recognized, a silence he understood, a silence he couldn't ignore. Emily told him everything, her voice steady as she spoke, her words a bridge between the past and the present, between the silence and the sound, between the plains and the sky, a bridge that brought Frank's story to life, that brought Elise's kindness to light, that brought a hero back finally, after all these years, after all the silence, after all the wind that had kept him apart. On a crisp Wednesday morning, the sound of jet engines filled the air above Rock Creek, a roar that shook the ground, that stopped Elise in her tracks, that made her heart pound with fear and curiosity. A sound that spoke of something big, something unexpected, a sound that would change everything, forever, for Elise, for Frank, for the town of Rock Creek, for the world that would hear their story, that would see their love, that would remember their kindness, their heroism, their humanity, in a way that would last, in a way that would matter, in a way that would echo, louder than words, louder than silence, louder than the wind that had kept them apart. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Quiet Stories for more untold tales of valor. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.